Hey there, and welcome to our third video this week in our Kingdom Citizenship Study. Some of you have commented on how helpful it was at the beginning to kind of set the stage to remember how Jesus is king over everything. There is nothing outside of his control. And in this video, I want to tie together some of those themes that we've looked at over the past weeks and then help us kind of set forth a vision for how we move forward from here. The first thing I want you to remember is that in the public sphere, there is no neutral ground. The public sphere is a battleground of all of the gods of the world. There are no religiously neutral laws or policies. But for various reasons that we looked at earlier on, the deck has been stacked against those who follow organized religions, and in some ways specifically Christians. People will say, leave your religion out of politics, but then smuggle their religion into the political sphere through a Trojan horse under the guise of family values or equality or justice or any other number of things. The question you need to ask in response to that, well, what defines your family values? What defines your equality? Behind that definition is some idea of morality, what ought to be, and that is always religious. There are no religiously neutral ideas of equality or rights or freedom. One of the things that I've learned through this process is to be less afraid to make overtly religious argument in some of these political discussions. And we should push back on the double standard that is there. Right? If you are able to bring your values, which are based on some idea of morality, into politics, then I should be able to bring my values, which happen to be based on my faith, into the political sphere as well. Today we said we are facing something like a tyranny of the majority, which if you remember, when that influence of natural law has waned, and the way that natural law is sustained through a culture is really through the church. The church has that preserving aspect to a culture. And so when that has been divorced from the broader culture, the idea that the foundation of natural law will have less influence, and then rights will no longer be defined by God, but by oneself. And when enough people believe that, it can lead to redefining morality to being whatever the most people think is right. And as Jonathan Leeman puts it, I dare say the American experiment, divorced from God, makes same-sex marriage, transgender bathroom debates, and the end of religious tolerance inevitable. Every person becomes his or her own God. Every citizen possesses the right to define one's own concept of existence. So how as we as Christians step into that public sphere? Jonathan Leeman gives three ways that Christians have often in the past done it. One is what he calls the Luther approach, with an appeal to one's conscience. It's this idea that we shouldn't want to burden another person's conscience by forcing them to do something they think is wrong. So for instance, if someone is a pacifist, our country makes allowance for that. You can be a conscientious objector so that you don't have to go and fight in a war, because we don't want to force on you something that you would think is morally wrong. And Christians can appeal to this as well. Another approach he calls the MLK approach, the Martin Luther King Jr. approach, which is an appeal to natural law. This is best seen in MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he writes, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law." So we can point to natural law, which is that law that is knowable to all humans through reason and conscience, to decide whether or not a law is just or not. MLK was using it to apply to unjust segregation laws, but we could apply it to other places as well. And then there is what he calls the sociological approach, right, where you point to, look at the studies, look at the social benefits of, say, a child that is raised in a two-parent home. And so because of that, shouldn't we support policies that encourage families to stay together? Leeman, though, says that there is another approach that Christians don't use as often, but he thinks maybe we should. And he calls it the Polycarp approach. He says the Polycarp approach doesn't look for common ground. It recognizes that every once in a while, it's good to show up and simply announce, "Behold your God." like the Old Testament prophets did. Polycarp was a pastor that lived almost 2,000 years ago in modern-day Turkey, and in 155 AD, he was arrested, and he was asked by the Roman governor to worship the emperor and curse Christ. And at his trial, Polycarp replied, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I curse my king who saved me?" And he was later burned at the stake. Now, you could make arguments against Polycarp's arrest and execution from some of the previous ways we just looked at, appealing to conscience, natural law, sociological benefits. And yet there's something that is so simple and beautiful about stating, Jesus is king of you and me. So do what you want, but he will make all things right in the end. This approach helps us from getting too wrapped up in what is happening right now and from blowing it out of proportion, of always thinking, oh, this election is the most important election ever. And it helps to put it into perspective of Jesus, who is still king. It helps us to remember and to rest in the power of a God who laughs at the nations as he looks down and sees all of them plotting their own destinies and their own ways. And instead of us always having to get too worked up about them and seeing, what's the latest headlines in the news now? What's Washington doing now? We can find peace in knowing who really is king and that no one threatens his rule. And although the argument of just saying Jesus is king, it doesn't seek to find that common ground of some of those other approaches. When you actually live that way, like Jesus actually is king, it puts forth a vision of life that sets you on a ground that is way more appealing than anything else. One of the greatest weaknesses of Christians today is we aren't living like Jesus is king. Our worry, our anxiety, our anger, how much we get wrapped up in every little political turmoil or drama, every news story, every conspiracy theory, it screams to the world as they're looking at Christians that, man, Christians don't really think God is in control. Or whatever God they believe in, he sure doesn't seem very powerful based on how afraid they are or how angry they are. And perhaps what is most needed today is for us to live and to talk and show through our actions that whatever happens on election day, whatever happens in the weeks after, you can't touch the peace that I have in knowing Jesus is king. And I think how we live, showing the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, especially when from a worldly perspective they look at Christians and things look really bad for us, and yet we're just blossoming with that fruit of the Spirit, that is one of the most compelling arguments you can make for others. We really believe Jesus is king. Look at what he's doing in my life when everything else is going to hell. That will get people's attention. Now, some people might think if you bring your religion into the political sphere, won't that just lead to violence, right? The last thing we want is a bunch of Christians running everything. There's kind of this sense today that the monotheistic religions, in particular Islam, Judaism, Christianity, they lead to violence because of their exclusivity. Many people in our country fear that, right? If you say your God is the only way and another one says his God's the only way, won't that lead to people fighting it out? Miroslav Volf, in his book, A Public Faith, addresses this very concern. And yes, Christianity, although along with many other religions, and let's throw atheism in there as well, has at times been justified to commit, or has been used to justify committing atrocities against others. But this only happens, Wolf says, is when elements of the Christian faith are taken in isolation from each other. And that forms what he calls a thin faith. He writes, the more we reduce faith to vague religiosity that serves primarily to energize, heal, and give meaning to the business of life, whose course is shaped by factors other than faith, such as national or economic interests, the worse off we will be. He's saying that when faith is reduced to serving other things in life, your own prosperity, your national interests, your economic interests, it will have a destructive effect on society, and that is a thin faith. But the error that people make when saying more religion leads to more violence is thinking it's just the quantity of religious attachment that leads to violent outcomes. In other words, the more religion, the more violence. But Wolfe says this is just a very unsophisticated and mistaken way of thinking about religion. The most relevant factor is rather the quality, or we could say the content of religious commitments. And if we look at the content of the Christian faith, Wolfe points us to the fundamental doctrine of the Trinity. He writes, the divine persons as non-self-enclosed identities are understood by the Christian tradition to form a perfect communion of love. The persons give themselves to each other and receive themselves from each other in love. None has to wrest anything from others. None has to impose anything on others. And none needs to secure oneself from the incursions of others. Far from being a life of violence, the life of the divine being is characterized by mutually uncoerced and welcomed generosity. It would be difficult to argue such a monotheism fosters violence. So it's not fundamentalism per se that results in religious violence. The better question is to ask, what is your fundamental? And when it is the triune God who is love, well, that becomes Christians' fundamental, not violence. Unfortunately, many people will trade that thick faith rooted in the Trinitarian God for a thin faith that serves not the Trinitarian God, but what they really worship, whether that's freedom, economic success, power, in the end, themselves. So to wrap up, what's our call? Particularly in these next few weeks when we'll see some here shortly rejoice in their victory, and we'll see others crushed in their defeat and worried about what's going to happen next. We'll see many speeches of victory and talking about all the progress that we've made, and other speeches talking about the decline of our nation. Perhaps maybe the best thing that we as Christians can do is spend some time meditating on Psalm 2 in light of whatever happens. Let me read the first part. Why are the nations so angry? Why do they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of the earth prepare for battle. The rulers plot together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they cry, and free ourselves from slavery to God. But the one who rules in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then in anger he rebukes them, terrifying them with his fierce fury. For the Lord declares, I have placed my chosen king on the throne in Jerusalem, on my holy mountain. No matter who wins in November, these truths are just as applicable. And what the world needs right now, more than anything, is to hear that message of the true king who is coming and who is both a lion and a lamb.